In 1889, 4 men opened a Kentucky root cellar, expecting to store potatoes. What they hauled out instead made grown men refuse to speak of it for the rest of their lives. Within a month, the farmhouse burned to its foundation. The family living there vanished, leaving no trace. A county ledger page describing their discovery was ripped out, never seen again. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. This is the story of what those 4 men found, why an entire village agreed, without ever quite saying so out loud, to bury it and forget it, and why the handful of descriptions that did survive, passed mouth to mouth for 3 generations, line up almost exactly with something far older, far larger, and far stranger than anyone in that narrow Appalachian valley was prepared to understand. To understand how strange this is, you have to understand the place. The valley sat in the eastern edge of Kentucky, in country so folded and steep that a man could live his whole life 4 miles from the next farm and speak to those neighbors maybe twice a year. The family there were the kind who kept to themselves and did not write much down. So, when something happened that was serious enough to reach the county seat, serious enough to put in on paper, it meant something had gone badly wrong. The farmhouse belonged to a family we will call the Hollisters, because the name that survives in the retellings is spelled 3 different ways, and no census confirms any of them. The Hollisters had lived on that land for 2 generations. The house was not old by the standards of the old country, but it sat on a foundation that was. And that foundation is where this begins. Because when the Hollisters' grandfather first cleared that ground, he did not dig his cellar from scratch. He found one already there. That detail gets skipped in most tellings, and it should not be. The stone-lined pit beneath that farmhouse was older than the family, older than the county, older than any settler anyone could name. The Hollisters had simply built their home on top of a cellar that was already waiting in the ground. For decades, they used it the way anyone would. They stacked jars in it, hung meat in it, and thought nothing of the fact that the stonework at the back went deeper and darker than a root cellar had any need to go. In the fall of 1889, the youngest Hollister son decided the family needed more storage before winter. He and 3 neighbors went down with picks and lanterns to open up the back wall, where the old stone seemed to seal off a further space. They expected to find nothing more than collapsed earth. Instead, their picks struck a wall that should not have been there. Not fieldstone, not the rough, dry-stacked rock of a frontier cellar. A wall of fitted brick, mortared tight, smooth as a courthouse chimney, sealing off a chamber that no one living had ever known was there. They stood there in the lantern light and argued about it. One neighbor wanted to leave it alone. Another said a sealed wall meant treasure, or a still, or a grave worth breaking through. The youngest Hollister settled it. It was his family's ground, and he wanted the space. So they swung the picks. It took most of an hour to open a gap wide enough for a man to pass. And when the first lantern went through that gap, the man holding it went silent. The others called to him, and he did not answer. When they pulled him back out, they said his hands were shaking so badly he could not hold a light. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the full inventory of what came out of that cellar, the exact measurements the county surveyor wrote down, the letter the school teacher mailed to the state capitol, the names of the 4 men who carried it out, and the date the record was sealed. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's continue. What they found behind that brick wall was a chamber, not large, perhaps 12 feet across, with a floor of the same fitted brick and a ceiling low enough that a tall man had to stoop. And laid out on the floor of that chamber on its back, arms folded across its chest, in the deliberate way the dead are arranged by the living, was a skeleton. Now, a skeleton in old ground is not by itself a horror. These hills held burial mounds older than memory, and every family that dug a well or a cellar turned up bone eventually. What stopped those 4 men cold was the size of it. The retellings do not all agree on the number, and I want to be honest with you that we are working from memory and second-hand account here, not from a photograph or a museum tag. But every version agrees on the same essential fact. The figure on that floor was enormous, not the size of a large man, the size of no man at all. The thigh bone alone, one of them said, ran from his own hip to the ground. The skull, another said, was wide enough that he could have fit his own head inside the jaw. 2 of the 4 never spoke of the measurements again. The one who did would only say that once you have knelt beside a thing that size, you stop wondering why someone built a wall to keep it down there. They had opened a grave built for something shaped like a person and sized like nothing that walks, and the grave had been made with care. This was the detail that turned fear into something worse. A wild thing, a freak of nature, a bare misremembered as a giant would have been dumped in a pit. This one had been laid out, arms folded, head to the east, the way Christian dead are laid to face the rising sun. Except that whoever folded those arms had done it long before any church stood in that valley, long before the brick that sealed the chamber was fired, long before, by the look of the stonework, anyone the settlers would have called a person lived in those hills at all. And there was more in the chamber than the figure. This is the part the tellings lower their voices for. Beside the skeleton, or resting on its chest, depending on who tells it, was an object, metal, not iron, because iron in wet ground for that long is a red stain and nothing more. This was pale metal, copper, or bronze, or something the men had no name for, and it had not rusted away. It was a plate or a tablet, roughly the size of a family Bible, and its face was covered edge to edge in marks, not English, not any letters the school teacher, who was later shown a copy, could read. Rows of small, deliberate, repeating symbols, cut deep and clean, as fresh as the day they were made. A giant laid out like a king sealed behind a wall of brick that no frontier family built, holding a metal book in a language no one in Kentucky could read. That is what 4 men found under a farmhouse, looking for a place to keep their potatoes. There is one more thing about that chamber that the careful tellers always insist on, and it is easy to miss because it sounds too small to matter. The air. When they broke through the brick, the air that came out was dry, bone dry in a cellar that had wept groundwater for 40 years. Whoever built that vault had sealed it so completely that 4 decades of Kentucky rain and snow had not put a single drop inside. The brick was mortared, the joints were tight, and the whole of it had been made to keep something in, or to keep the world out, by hands that understood the work far better than the men who broke it open. That is not the craft of a lost traveler or a passing tribe. That is the craft of a people who built to last, and who had a reason to want this particular grave to stay shut. Word did not spread the way you would expect. You would think a find like that would bring the whole county running. Instead, the opposite happened. The men who saw it came back up out of that cellar and made a decision together right there in the yard that they would tell as few people as possible. One of them, the one who had gone in first, is said to have gotten on his knees in the dirt and prayed, and then told the others that some doors are sealed by better sense than ours, and they had just broken one open. They went to the only 2 men in the valley anyone deferred to, the preacher and the school teacher. The preacher came, looked, and would not go inside. The school teacher went in, and he was the one who did the one thing that lets us know any of this is more than a ghost story. He measured. He copied. He took the strange plate up into the light, laid paper over it, and rubbed charcoal across the surface to capture the symbols the way you would copy a gravestone. And then he wrote a letter. He addressed it to the state capital, to men he believed would want to know that something like this had come out of the ground. That letter, and what came back, is where this story stops being a local tale and starts being something with a shape you have seen before. Because the school teacher's letter was answered. And the answer did not come from a curious scholar delighted by a discovery. The answer came from men who arrived within weeks by wagon dressed for the city, who did not want the find celebrated. They wanted it gone. Before we move on to what happened on the 3rd night, stop for a second. What you just heard about the sealed wall and the men who came to make it disappear is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the county's own handwritten ledger, the wall thickness, the sealed date. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The men who came were not from the county, and by most accounts, not from the state. They carried papers. They spoke about authority and about the public good, and about how objects of this kind belonged with people equipped to study them properly. To a valley of farmers who could barely read a deed, papers and city clothes and confident speech were as good as law. nobody stopped them. They spent 3 days at the Hollister farm. On the first day, they went down into the chamber and stayed a long time. On the second day, they had the local men build a sledge and rig block and tackle over the cellar mouth. And on the third night, by lantern, because they did not want it done in daylight, where the neighbors could see, they brought the giant up out of the ground. It is the third night that the old people always came back to. They said you could hear it. Not the figure, of course, the work, the scrape of the sledge, the men calling low to each other, the crack of timber, taking a weight it was not sure it could hold. And they said that the Hollister family's dogs, and every dog for a mile, howled the entire night and would not stop. And that in the morning the milk had soured in every spring house in the hollow. And that the youngest Hollister boy, the one who had swung the first pick, had gone gray at the temples in a single night like a man twice his age. The giant was crated. The metal plate was taken. The charcoal rubbing the schoolteacher had made was taken too. Or so he believed, until years later he admitted to a nephew that he had made 2 and kept one hidden in the family Bible. The men from the city paid the Hollisters more money than the farm was worth, and the payment came with a condition stated plainly. They were to fill the chamber, seal the cellar, and never speak of what had been there. Within the month, whether by accident or design, the farmhouse burned. The family took the money and left, and the page of the county ledger that recorded the whole affair, the measurements, the letter, the names, was found by the next clerk to be torn cleanly out. Now, here is where I have to be careful with you, and honest. Everything from this point is pattern, not proof, but the pattern is worth seeing. Because this story, a giant skeleton found in old and deliberate stonework, examined by locals, reported to authorities, and then quietly removed by official men who made sure it was never studied publicly again, is not a story that belongs only to one valley in Kentucky. It is a script, almost, that the country ran again and again. It is a story that shows up in almost the same shape in newspaper after newspaper across the whole of the 19th century. Ohio, Wisconsin, Nevada, West Virginia just over the ridge. Small papers ran the accounts. Large institutions, when they responded at all, sent men to collect, and after the collecting the giants stopped being mentioned. The bones did not go on display. They went into storage no one could visit, and then out of the record entirely. And you have to sit with how strange that is. When a farmer plows up an old coin, a museum wants it. When a well-digger finds a mastodon tooth, scholars fight over it. For a generation. Discovery is the whole point of these institutions. It is what they exist to do. So, why is this one category of find, the oversized human skeleton in the deliberate old stonework, the one thing that consistently arrives, gets collected, and then evaporates? A single lost report you could call carelessness. A single burned rubbing you could call bad luck. But when the same shape repeats across a dozen states and half a century, the careless answer stops being enough. Something was being sorted. Some finds were allowed to become history and some were quietly decided against. And this is where the people who look hard at the last few centuries start using a word you may have heard. Because the strangeness of that Kentucky chamber was never really the skeleton. It was the architecture. A wall of fitted mortared brick, smooth and precise, sealing a burial vault in a valley where the settlers built in rough fieldstone and log, is a wall that somebody made who was not a settler and was not the native peoples of those hills either. Because their earthworks, remarkable as they are earth and not fired brick. So, who fired and laid that brick, and when and for whom? The theory that has grown up around finds like these holds that the world we think we inherited, empty, and waiting for our great-grandparents to build it, was not empty at all. That an older order stood here first. Its people were larger. Its building was finer than the log cabin frontier that supposedly followed it, and that this older world was buried, sometimes literally, under a layer of soil and mud, and forgetting so complete that we now walk over its cellars and mistake them for our own. The name attached to that lost order, borrowed from old maps that labeled a vast and now vanished swath of the world, is Tartaria. You do not have to accept the whole of that idea to feel the weight of the specific problem in that Kentucky cellar. Set the giants aside for a moment. Set the maps aside. You are still left with a fired brick vault, mortared watertight, buried in a foundation older than the county, in a place where every building anyone could account for was made of log and rough stone. Brick is not a casual material. It means kilns. It means a formula for the clay, a controlled fire, a supply chain, a plan. Somebody in those hills, at some point no history book will name, had all of that. And then somebody made very sure that the one grave which proved it would never be examined by anyone who might ask the obvious question out loud. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that a global empire of giants was scrubbed from the history books by men in wagons. What I will tell you is that the people in that Kentucky Valley did not need a theory. They had a hole in the ground, with a brick wall in it that none of them built, a body in it that none of them could explain, and a group of official strangers who took both away in the dark and made sure the paper that proved it existed was destroyed. Whatever you want to call the thing that was buried there, someone with the authority to erase a county record decided that you and I were never supposed to know it was found. So, what survived? Less than you would want, and more than you would expect. The farmhouse is gone. The family scattered. The ledger page is ash. But the schoolteacher kept his second charcoal rubbing, and it stayed folded in a family Bible for the better part of 100 years, brought out only rarely, shown to only a few. The descriptions we have of the symbols on that plate, rows of small deliberate marks repeating and unreadable, are the descriptions of the people who saw that rubbing before it, too, was lost in a house fire in the 1970s, which is either the grimmest coincidence in this whole account, or exactly the kind of thing that keeps happening to the evidence in stories like this one. And there is the cellar itself. The Hollister land changed hands many times over the century that followed. The foundation is still out there, they say. Grown over, the cellar collapsed and filled. Nobody has dug it. The families who own that kind of ground learn early which parts of it to leave alone. And a filled cellar that the old people warned about is exactly the kind of place a wise man does not put a shovel. Every few years, someone with a metal detector asks the family for permission to look. Every few years, they are told no, politely and firmly, by people who will not explain why. The valley learned that once and does not intend to learn twice. So, that is what 4 men found beneath a Kentucky farmhouse in the autumn of 1889. A sealed chamber older than the county. A body too large to be a man laid out with the care you give a king. A metal plate written in a language no one could read. And a response, swift and official and final, that treated a discovery like a thing to be contained rather than understood. Maybe it was a story that grew in the retelling. Country tales do that, but tales do not usually come with torn ledger pages and men in city clothes hauling crates out of a hollow at night. And they do not usually match, detail for detail, 100 other accounts from 100 other valleys, all ending the same way, with the giant taken and the record gone. The people in that valley made their peace with not knowing. They sealed the cellar, kept their silence, and let the hills fall back over the whole thing. But you do not have to, because the one piece of that story that was never supposed to leave that valley, the measurements, the names, the schoolteacher's own account of what he saw and copied and mailed away, is exactly the piece I have reconstructed and set down for you. And it is waiting in the description right now. Go and read what the men in the wagons did not want written down, and then ask yourself, how many other cellars are still out there, sealed, waiting, with the record of them already torn out?